Our first speaker, Dimitri Laboury, is the research director of the FNRS, the National Foundation for Scientific Research of Belgium, at the University of Liège, where he teaches ancient Egyptian art history, archaeology, history, and history of religion as a professor. He is trained in Egyptology and art history and specialized in the study of ancient Egyptian artists, their status, and their various practices, from painterly practices to sculpture production, especially royal statuary and the issue of portraiture in this context. So welcome, Dimitri.
I'd like to extend my thanks to the organizing committee and especially to Rogero Sousa to invite me to share my thoughts on royal portraiture in the time of Tutankhamun. I'm very happy, I'm really delighted to be back to Lisbon and to take part to this very nice and most interesting event, especially in this magnificent venue created by an art lover or collector, or maybe I should say now after Tom Art lecture, an art speculator, since I want to discuss artistic matters with you today. So my top, oops. No. It changes on the screen here, but not on yours. Shall I try again? No? Thank you. So my title is The Man Behind the Mask, or I could say the quest or the obsession of the man behind the mask, in order to address the issue of royal portraiture in the Post-Amarna art, and especially in the time of Tutankhamun. As we all know now from the first session of this afternoon, the discovery of the almost untouched tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon a century ago immediately kindled a worldwide fascination for the boy king, with a phenomenon nowadays designated as Tutmania. You know almost everything about Tutmania since this early part of the afternoon. In this context, many reconstructions of the physical appearance of the young pharaoh were generated, meeting the general expectations of feeling visually close to the historical figure of the end of the 14th century BC, affectionately called King Tut since 1923. And so I chose the same images as Valentina, with highly imaginative reconstructions of the appearance of Tutankhamun, already called King Tut, in the ambience of Orientalistic approach of ancient Egypt, of course. When sometimes later Howard Carter reached the mummy, it was quite a big surprise for many beholders to realize that old King Tut was not a wise old nut, but a young boy, a teenager, who passed away before reaching his 20s. Sorry. Yes. So, as I just said, this generated a lot of reconstructions of the physical appearance of the young pharaoh since the discovery. And what is really striking in those generated reconstructions is the discrepancy between all of them. So you have a variability according to the creators of those reconstructions and according to the ethnic origins, which is quite striking, as you can see here. And it doesn't match so well with the mummy, because we have the skull, we have the dried body of Tutankhamun, and if you compare, the matching is not superb. And it's very clear that there's a strong influence of the art of the time, as you can see here, or here, for example, with this official image of Tutankhamun. I've skipped, sorry, oops, an image, because I wanted to stress that doesn't work, sorry. So I wanted to quote an excerpt from Howard Carter, who thought that those images could be used historically, so we can see Tutankhamun as he was crowned with this head of the head of Tutankhamun blooming out of a lotus flower, and with the mask we could see him as if we were in front of him when he passed away. So there was this idea of reading those depictions of Tutankhamun as historical evidence. So it's very strange. Maybe it does work better with this. And so even nowadays we have very weird reconstructions of the entire body of Tutankhamun. As you can see, it doesn't match with the bodily remains, with a club-footed, heavily handicapped Tutankhamun matching with the current inclusive thinking of nowadays. As you can see from this comparison, there's a discrepancy between the mummy and the various preserved portraits of the king. And there is also, it was noted long ago, a variability between the sculpted portrait of the king. Sometimes you have a smiling face of Tutankhamun, which is his official face, and sometimes you have a more bitter with furrows at the corners of the mouth, and we know that it's someone else. I'm going to get back to this in a moment. So this raises a lot of methodological questions and methodological problems, and the first one is, can we reconstruct the actual physical appearance from an artistic representation of someone? So I will use a quite extreme example, as you're going to see, but it allows me to make my point from an art historical point of view. So probably you don't know this person, you know the sculpture. It's the famous Mrs. Pogani, Margaret Pogani, made by Constantin Brancusi. Of course, when you have the pictures of the model and you have the work of art, there's something between the two of them. But it's possible to make the way from the picture to the depiction, but not the other way around. It doesn't work at all. And contemporary art provides us with many examples of this kind, like here Dora Maar, who was one of the main lovers of Picasso. You can see that there's a connection, but it's impossible to make your way back to the picture or the actual face of the person. You could argue, of course, here it's Amarna art. It's Amarna period, Mr. Laboury, and so it's the most lifelike of ancient Egyptian art, or allegedly the most lifelike of ancient Egyptian art. So we see with this very brief introduction that we are facing here many preconceptions and methodological questions, and also modern expectations towards those images. So first thing, from a methodological point of view, I think we have to define the concept we are using. And so the first question will be, what is a portrait? In general, from an anthropological point of view, not only from a Western modern point of view. And the second one is, how can we characterize or assess the alleged realism of Athenist art? Because it's an hypothesis, of course. So first thing, what is a portrait? A portrait can be defined in general art history as a recognizable depiction of an individual. So it means that it must be an individual and you must be able to recognize him or her. This implies that it doesn't need to be realistic, of course. This is our own concern of modern and Eurocentric approach. It just needs to allow you to recognize an individual. The second question, if it agrees to work, is how can we characterize or assess the alleged realism of Athenist art? First of all, I'd like to stress, to emphasize the iconographic virtuality in physical depiction. So we are used to think that Akhenaten looked like this, that was his real appearance when you compare again with the bodily remains of the mummy, of which we know nowadays for sure that he was Akhenaten, the body of KV 55. There's a big discrepancy. Once again, it doesn't match. So it's clear that we are facing here with an artistic rendering or an artistic interpretation, projection of the individuality of Akhenaten. That's the first thing. Is it possible to have a more emic point of view on the aesthetic choice that led to this depiction? The answer is yes, because we have some tools to look at ancient Egyptian art through ancient Egyptian eyes, or more or less ancient Egyptian eyes. They provided us with this system of grid, of proportions. As you probably know, there were 18 square grid in classic art, Egyptian art before Akhenaten, and at the time of Akhenaten, they changed the system from 18 to 20 square grids. So it's very interesting to see where they added the 2 extra squares. And it's very easy to show that they added them in the length of the neck and also in the length of the torso to emphasize the contrast between the waist and the haunches. So keep this in mind. Another thing is the stylistic tricks that were used in this art. So you know that we are supposed to think that they had very elongated skulls. When you look at those skulls, it's very easy to demonstrate that the very same person, when he has a shaven skull, the skull is elongated. When he wears a wig, the skull is normal again. And it works in Karnak or in Amarna. So it's a stylistic trick. So what about the depiction of the body? It has been stressed by many scholars, including Jan Assmann, that the body of Nefertiti was supposed to embody the concept of beauty in Amarna ideology, is some sort of a rhetoric of beauty, and we have a depiction in text, I mean, a poem from the early Ramesside period, which allows us to understand what are the characteristics of a beautiful lady of that time. And so you have a description on the right-hand side of the screen, and you can see that it matches with the lengthening of the neck. She's supposed to have a long neck, and the text also said that her hips are plump and her waist is tight, so that her haunches increase her beauty. So it's exactly what is described in the text and what matches with the depiction. So it's about depiction of beauty, of feminine beauty, both for female and male figures. I won't go into too many details in this lecture because it's too long, but keep this in mind, it's aestheticizing. The same holds true for the depiction of hands. If you look at the hands, so hands in ancient Egyptian art have never been so less hieroglyphic. It's like you have a hand in 3 dimensions. But if you count the phalanxes, you will see that they have 3 phalanxes like you and me, and then there's a supernumerary phalanx in the shape given to the hands, which shows that it's an aestheticizing effect. It's not copying reality. Making things look real, and it matches with the papyrus Chester BT1 that we have seen just a moment before. Making things look real doesn't mean that reality is actually depicted. As Hegel aimed at theorizing, the goal of art can never be the imitation of nature. The competition would be lost before it even began. This means that what is usually described as realism or naturalism, or in a better way, a more perceptual transposition of nature and reality, does not aim at representing the latter as it is, but rather constitute a stylistic strategy, a form, to quote one of my PhD students, Alessio Deli Castelli, a form of sensual alluring to draw the spectator in, and in the end, nothing more than a form of pretense. In other words, the so-called Amarna art realism is a stylistic orientation made of what the French semiotician and literary theorist Roland Barthes called reality effect, that is, rhetorical tricks used in any novel to convey an impression or a sense of reality, although reality is not actually depicted. So we have reality effect that creates a virtual reality, and this is what we are dealing here with Amarna art, of course. What about the physiognomy and the portrait? So a couple of decades ago, investigating the perfect beauty of Nefertiti's Berlin bust, Rolf Krauss, then curator in the Egyptisch Museum in Berlin, recreated or aimed at recreating the original design of this bust as seen through the sculptor's eyes, when the artist prepared his work on the parallelepiped limestone block by projecting a grid graduated in ancient Egyptian measuring units, that is 1 finger, it's 1.875 centimeters, it's very precise, on a 3D recording of the Queen's effigy to avoid any photographic distortions. He thus was able to show that every important facial feature is positioned on the line or at the intersection of 2 lines. This demonstrates how much the so-called most lifelike of ancient Egyptian art was artificially constructed. She was photoshopped, like our current models nowadays. This demonstrates, yes, how much the so-called most lifelike of Egyptian art was artificially constructed. Moreover, Krauss was able to show that the upper part of the face of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, from the bottom of the nose to the beginning of the crown, that is the upper square in the square grid of ancient Egyptian art, is exactly identical in size as well as in shape, as you can see here. Further 3D investigation of the bust of Akhenaten in the Louvre allows to go a step further and to show that actually all the features that defines the face of both king and queen are exactly at the same level, including the lips. It's only one detail that changed the physiognomy, it's the position of the chin. So you just change one parameter and you have another visage or another face. So they were expert in that kind of things. So even if it is, and those marked features, they correspond to some models for sculptures that were published by Nadia Toumoum in her PhD, which shows how sculptors were trained in ancient Egyptian art, including in late period art. So even if it's tantalizing to imagine some sort of physiognomic convergence between Akhenaten and Nefertiti's actual face and the apparently very individualized sculpted portraits, this reveals without any possible doubt that the official images idealized them. It's unavoidable. So it's an artistic rendering and an aesthetic choice. So we are exactly, in this case, like Mrs. Pogani, it's exactly the same thing. It's an artistic transposition, and you cannot go back to the original face of the model. So what about Tutankhamun? Knowing what we have seen, how can we understand the official portrait of Tutankhamun? It's clear that they created a physiognomy compatible with the very young age of the king and his actual face, but not of the same shape, not of the same size. If you look at this comparison, I think you can still hear me. If you look, so it's Sandro Vanini's montage, it looks the same, but here it's the teeth. So the face doesn't match, and you don't have the lower part. And for any royal portrait that can be compared with royal mummies for the 18th dynasty, it's always the case. You see that the faces, the actual faces, were longer than the one in the portraits, sculpted portraits. As I just mentioned in the beginning of my talk, there is another face among the treasure of Tutankhamun. You all know that it depicts the elusive figure Neferuaten. I won't go into details of who she was, but she has another face, it's clear. And this is based on epigraphic evidence. We know for sure it's Neferuaten's face. This face can be traced back to some models found in sculptor's workshop in Amarna. So this is the original version of what is found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And without going into the discussion of who was Neferuaten, it's very interesting to see the connection between the official face of all the 6 daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They all have the same face. It's an official face once again, which is derived from the face of Tiye and the one of Akhenaten. So we have an evolution from this model that was in a way Akhenatenified when she became the king. And then, sorry, we can follow an evolution because we know that the objects that were reserved for Tutankhamun, they refer to the return to the polytheistic representation of the world, so they are late in the time of the reign of Neferuaten. And so you can see that the head of Tutankhamun was invented on the model of this face, which is an artificial face, derived itself from the face of Akhenaten, with a more squarish face, which reminds, of course, if you know a little bit about royal portraiture in the 18th dynasty, the face of Amenhotep III, or to use local resources, I would refer to this Gulbenkian little head. So we have an evolution which is completely linear, and just like for Nefertiti compared to Akhenaten, they just change one element. It's the position of the shin, and it changes the picture, but you have a clear evolution from one model to the other. What is really intriguing is that this model continued in the aftermath of Tutankhamun. So you have Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and then his followers. Indeed, if we look at the portraiture of Ai, all the portraits we have of Ai depicts him as a young man, as if he was also an elder, a teenager, just like Tutankhamun. So he's using Tutankhamun's mask. And it fits with all the depictions of King Ai. We know who this Ai was. Nozomu Kawai could give you a lecture of 4 hours or 5 hours on this guy. He was a top elite member of the court of Amenhotep I, connected with Tei, who was the nurse of Nefertiti, and he might have been connected with Nefertiti. He might have been the father of Nefertiti, which would mean the maternal grandfather of Tutankhamun. So he was quite old. When he accessed the throne, he had the age of being the grandfather, if he was not the real grandfather, of Tutankhamun when he buried the boy king, King Tut. And we have evidence of a monument that he dedicated to the memory of Tutankhamun, where he doesn't say, according to the uses of ancient Egyptian dedication text, I made this for my father, I made this for my son, because the discrepancy of ages was too obvious. He had the age of being the grandfather of the boy king. What is also very interesting about those blocks who are currently studied by Mark Gabon, who's going to publish them, is that somebody erased the names of Ai, but not the titles, to usurp the action of Ai to pay homage to Tutankhamun. You have here clear evidence. We know who did this, because those blocks were reused in monuments of Horemheb. Horemheb, the second successor of Tutankhamun, also appears as a young teenager, as you can see here. But we know also his curriculum vitae, and he was a top general in the time of Tutankhamun, most probably also in the time of Akhenaten. So again, he was an old guy. I mean, by this, he must have been my age. So at that time, he was an old guy. And we know that when he started his reign, he wanted to step into his predecessor's shoes. So some fragments now kept in the British Museum shows that he dedicated some statues, or these are fragments of bases of statues, in the Great Aten Temple in Amarna. So he wanted to fit in the continuity of his predecessors. And then he decided to reuse the action of Ai regarding the monumental commemoration of Tutankhamun, and decided to dump all those things in the rubbish bin of history and to forget about them. So he's the one who really buried the Amarna kings, including Tutankhamun. So we know who benefited from this crime. And again, if you look at his face, it's the same. It's the face of Tutankhamun with some slight variations. I can erase the nose here because it's a reconstruction. It's the face of Tutankhamun, it's the mask again. This is the same also for the next king, Ramses I, who was also a newcomer. He was not the heir of his predecessor. He was also very old, because we know that when he accessed the throne, he was a grandfather. Ramses II was already born. And when you look at his depictions, it's Tutankhamun's mask, once again, basically. And according to Ulrich Sorosian's study of his early Ramesside portraiture and statuary, it's only in the time of Seti I that they try to change. So Seti I is the first to be the son of his predecessor, the son of his father, if I may say so. So we have this statue, which, according to Ulrich Sorosian, depicted from the beginning Seti I. It might be a usurpation. And from this, then they created the the elongated version of the Ramesside face with this long, curved, hooked nose that you all know, which is the base of the face of Ramses II. So you have here again the evolution. So if I want to summarize the evolution, we start from Akhenaten, that they modify the size of the visage, but to make a visual connection with Akhenaten for Neferuaten. Then they modify, they squarish this face according to the model of Amenhotep III, forgetting about Akhenaten to create the head of Tutankhamun, the official visage of Tutankhamun. And then from this onward, they reused it for 3 reigns, successive reigns of, let's say, usurpators or newcomers. And it's only in the time of Seti I, the first who was the son of his predecessors, that they dare to create a new visage. And then they forgot about the depictions of predecessors. They dumped into the rubbish bin of history all the Amarna kings and their models. So, and this, as you know, this is the basis for the whole Ramesside portraiture for 2 centuries. It has been stressed that there are some connections between the mummy of Seti I and the same for Ramses II. But again, if you compare a statue portrait and the mummies, it doesn't match so well. You see, so, and in this case, I suspect, and it's not because I devoted my PhD to the statuary of this guy, I suspect that the model of the great king Thutmose III might have played a role in the creation of this new visage, because we know that they copied inscriptions from the reign of Thutmose III, so they had some sort of admiration of Thutmose III. So it's time to conclude. Thank you for reminding me. So those portraits were official images meant to represent the royal institution and ideology the kings embodied, rather than the individuals they were. So the fundamental nature of royalty, of royal continuity, was in a specific historic context, of course, rather than simple perceptible appearances. It appears impossible to reconstruct in a faithful or reliable way the actual face of the king, though we have the dried version of the mummies. But is it really interesting to do so? To surrender this to the almost voyeuristic wish to feel visually close to such historical figures, as though we could look at them face to face. It's like the Prince Harry effect that we are now currently living with this new biography. So forget about this. It's more interesting to see. We don't have access to the real or actual face of those kings anymore, but we have the face they wanted to convey of themselves, of their power, their meaningful or cementized visage. And I think it's even more interesting. So once again, it doesn't match clearly, but it's a plausible version of the face of the king connected with his young age, as we know. And this other reality, this intended reality that is conveyed through royal portraiture, is probably more interesting in our historical perspective, because if our face does not really have a meaning in itself, this cementized and official visage of the king and the royal institution embodied definitely had and still have one historical signification. And in this sense, Howard Carter was right to state that it was possible to use those faces from an historical point of view, but not the way he wanted to do it a century ago. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dimitri.